In his opinion, Sue Benford and Joe Marino were right. In 1988, science declared that it was impossible for the Shroud of Turin to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. It was only 700 years old. Sue Benford and Joe Marino offered the first real challenge to the carbon dating results. They believed that they had proved the carbon dating wrong because the section from where the samples were taken had been tainted with 16th century cotton fibers. Chemist Ray Rogers, an original STIRP member, thought the Benford-Marino theory was wildly implausible.
He just didn't buy it. He said, that's nonsense. It can't be true. He was the gunfighter of STIRP. He was one of those guys that if he didn't like what you were saying, he'd have pulled out his 6-shooter and fired off 6 before he had a chance to take a breath. He was not very tolerant, especially of people doing bad science.
It sounds far-fetched. I mean, it does sound extremely convenient. You know, I didn't believe it myself when I came up with it.
Rogers was in a unique position to confirm or dismiss Benford and Marino's theory.
Ray had in his possession, from 1978, the tape samples lifted from the surface of the shroud. But remember, those were not big fibers. Those were fibrils taken from the surface. He also had some samples that were taken from the shroud by Professor Reyes, who took samples in 1973 from a corner that was immediately adjacent to the area taken for carbon dating.
What few realized was that Ray Rogers was in a race against time. He was losing a long battle with cancer. His old friend, Barry Schwartz, recorded this interview to ensure Ray could recount in his own words what he did next.
So I read their paper and I thought, I've got the samples that can shoot that full of holes. So I got out the Ross samples and I got out the Shroud samples and I went to work again.
A couple hours later he calls me and he goes, boy, he says, I can't believe it. He says, they were right. There's cotton here. He says, there's no cotton in the rest of the shroud, but there's cotton interwoven here. They must be right.
No one was more shocked than Rogers himself. His initial observation seemed to confirm Benford and Marino's hypothesis. But he knew to be absolutely certain he needed to examine the threads that were carbon dated.
Until I could get a sample from the real radiocarbon cloth, a documented sample, I couldn't prove anything.
The carbon dating process destroys the sample as part of the dating procedure. But all the labs involved in 1988 had held on to a small sample as a reserve.
The authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them.
Rogers was now convinced that Benford and Marino had been right. In fact, he found other evidence they had missed, which proved the shroud had been repaired with cotton fibers in exactly the section where the carbon dating samples had been taken.
If you happen to hit a place where a yarn segment from the original shroud was spliced into the new reweave part, the splice very definitely shows the new yarn that was being put in and dyed to match. The only thing in the shroud that was dyed or stained was this radiocarbon area. So my hypothesis at the moment is that this was done on purpose to fool your eye.
Rogers also returned to STIRP's 1978 experiments to see if there was anything the carbon dating labs had overlooked.
And when we went back and looked at the ultraviolet photographs, here is this area that's significantly darker. It doesn't fluoresce as much, and it's just this area around the Ross sample and where the radiocarbon sample was cut. And if they had looked at any of the photographs that we had and studied the information we had as of 1978, they would have known that that was the worst possible place they could have taken a sample.
Had somebody paid attention to my photographs of 78 and other data that we gathered, they would have chosen a different area.
My conclusion is that that area was manipulated. It was done by somebody with great skill and different materials than were used to make the shroud.
In 2005, just 5 weeks before losing his battle with cancer, Rogers published the last paper of his distinguished career. He did not call into question the science of the carbon dating labs. In fact, he believed they were accurate, but only for the damaged section of the shroud. In his opinion, the results told us nothing about the true age of the main body of the shroud. But, to his great frustration, he also discovered another carbon dating test might not be possible. In 1988, a carbon dating test concluded the Shroud of Turin was only 700 years old. It had been dismissed as a hoax. But what if that was wrong? What if, as Sue Benford and Joe Marino argue, the dating had been tainted by the presence of medieval fibers? If they're right, then the Shroud of Turin might just be what the faithful believe it to be.
I don't believe in miracles, no way.
At the end of his life, Ray Rogers had been pulled back into his lab by Benford and Marino's theory. To his astonishment, he found himself agreeing with them.
I'm coming to the conclusion that it has a very good chance of being the piece of cloth that was used to bury the historic Jesus.
He writes a paper that's accepted for publication in Thermochemica Acta, January of 2005. And that paper is the only peer-reviewed science that challenges the carbon date with anything credible up until that point in time.
Rogers was perhaps the only person who could confirm this theory, as he had access to fibers from both the main body of the shroud and the carbon-dated section. He also knew from his own experiments in 1978 the shroud was free of any pigments or dyes. And yet, when he looked at threads from the corner where the carbon dating samples had been cut, that's exactly what he found. Dyes, gums, resins, all signs that this section had been repaired hundreds of years ago.
You've got photomicrographs that demonstrate this very clearly. The cotton fibers from the radiocarbon sample are fairly heavily coated with the gum dye mordant, and some of the linen fibers don't show any of that at all. They look just as slick as anything, and it didn't stick to them.
Here's the whole crux of it. Linen is very difficult to dye, and it ages as time goes on, so it's colored. So in order to match a reweaving with the original color, you have to use cotton, and you dye the cotton. Ray found some waxes on those samples that suggested to him that the threads were from a so-called invisible reweaving process.
But Rogers knew that his findings needed to be tested with equipment far more advanced than he had had in his home lab.
I was given this assignment by a dying man, and I wanted to complete what he had hoped for.
Bob Villarreal was a colleague of Rogers at the Los Alamos National Lab. As a dying wish, Rogers asked his friend to independently confirm his findings.
It was a race for him because he knew he was dying. He wanted to know, is this corner of the shroud of the same composition, whether it was flax or linen or cotton? If it was cotton, it's not the same as the main shroud.
But before any tests could be conducted, Ray lost his long battle with cancer on March 8, 2005. He was 78 years old. After Rogers' death, Villarreal was determined to confirm his friend's findings. He sent the fibers Ray had given him to a colleague at the Los Alamos lab. Right away, something remarkable happened.
I received a call from him, and he said, the thread that I was going to analyze broke into 2 pieces. Is God going to be mad at me?
The threads turned out to be 2 separate pieces woven together, just as Benford and Marino predicted. But even more important was what held them together, a mordant, a gum-like substance